What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, episode 38 of the podcast. And my guest today, once again, is Phil Rothermick, known as PLL Updates on Twitter. And this is kind of a second episode to a what if scenario that we're doing this week around pro lacrosse. If you go back to episode 37, you can check that out. That one was around a possible future merger in pro lacrosse between the MLL and PLL. So, this next what if scenario that we're going to get into with you guys today is the idea of what if Pat Spencer, the former number one overall pick in the PLL, had chosen to play lacrosse in 2019 instead of electing to play basketball that year. So, Phil, first of all, welcome back into the show.
Hey, brother, thanks so much for having me. You know, I love being here. It's always a lot of fun. So, thanks again for having me back.
Yep. So I just kind of want to go through and kind of preface this discussion and kind of give the people a background on this topic as a whole. So Pat Spencer was the first player, like I said, taken in that 2019 PLL collegiate draft. He then opted to skip the PLL that summer to play basketball at Northwestern after he had grad transferred from Loyola. And then the Archers later on in 2019 would then secure the number one overall pick again in 2020 after they took down the Atlas in that number one overall pick game during the 2019 season. And with that pick, they selected Grant Amon, as we all know, out of Penn State. And he would go on to tally 6 goals and 14 assists in his rookie campaign during that championship series a few weeks ago. So really, my question for you and the question of this whole episode is, what would have happened with all that I just said from when he was drafted back in 2019 until now? What would have happened if Pat Spencer had opted into playing in the PLL back in 2019?
Well, first, I just want to say, what are the odds that the Archers get the number one pick again and draft an unbelievable attackman? Like, it is almost funny how they got that sort of redemption after losing that first pick. However, you know, when you think about Pat Spencer, you think of a guy that had it all. I mean, he's a big body guy, but he still figures out ways to make these finesse moves at the same time, you know. So if he did go to the Archers, it would have been amazing to see how their team clicked differently from the get-go. You know, they have as we all know, Holman and Manny on the wings. They had some different things changing at X, and they did okay that first year at X. However, if they had Pat Spencer, they would have already had that piece, and they would have had that attack unit done, set in stone.
Right.
So if you have Pat Spencer there and they're killing it, they certainly, in my opinion, would have done even better throughout that first season. But that aside, you know, you get to season number 2. And if you have Pat Spencer, there's not really a need to draft Grant Ament, right?
Yeah.
So then you start to wonder, who would they have drafted? How far would Grant have slid? Who would have drafted Grant? So it's a thing that would have not just affected the Archers and think wow, the Archers would have been so much better. That's so fun to think about. It would have affected the entire league.
Yeah.
And we would see different players on different teams right now, and it would be kind of it is kind of fun to think about those players and where they might have ended up. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it would have sent shockwaves throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, and you pretty much hit every one of my points, but you know, I had here that Archers probably wouldn't get the number one overall pick like you mentioned in 2020. That pick would likely then go, in my mind at least, to the Atlas. And I feel like for them, their strategy wouldn't have been too much different than what they did. I think that they still would have selected Brian Costabile, but they would have taken him in this case number 1 versus number 2, where they actually ended up taking him. And I think, like you mentioned, the biggest thing is that with Pat Spencer already there as their ex-attackman, there's no need for Amon, so they probably wouldn't select him in that first round with that pick. But I think more interesting than that is, and I think you kind of touched on this too, is that with Pat Spencer, they probably don't end up with one of those top 3 or 4 picks. They probably maybe get as high as 4, probably somewhere in like that 5 range. And I think that by then a guy like Grant Amon's already off the board. So either way you look at it, they probably still don't end up with him, even though, like you said, there probably isn't that real necessity for him anymore given this situation. So I think it is interesting when you think about, because if they slid all the way back to 4, the three teams that came after them would then each move up a spot. So then 1, 2, and 3 would go Atlas, Water Dogs, and Chrome. And it's interesting to note that in the actual collegiate draft this year, the Water Dogs took Michael Kraus, and the Chrome selected Tom Rigney, and both those guys opted for the MLL this season. So it's actually very interesting because one of those two would have probably more than likely ended up with Eamon. So my question for you is, between the two, who do you think was more likely to have ended up with him in that case?
Right. It's that's that's a tough one on me. There's if I had to say something, I might go with the Water Dogs. But it's hard because Ament is such a big talent that any team could pick Ament and think we can put him in here somewhere.
Right.
He's such a big a talent that it's almost like just draft him and we can figure out, do we want to use him, do we want to trade him, just
Right.
like we need to get this guy. If I had to pick, I'd say the Water Dogs, but that's a real tough one, man. Yeah, I'm struggling. I'm sitting. I'm just zoning out. Like my brain's going all over the place. But
Right. And
anyhow, yeah,
yeah, and that's, I think, what makes doing these topics like we did with episode 37 and then this one today, they're definitely topics that make you think, and you kind of have to consider all different aspects of that what if scenario, because it's not just what if this, it's what if A, B, C, and D, and you just kind of go down the line. And like you said earlier, the whole Grant Ament versus Pat Spencer thing, it doesn't just affect the Archers, it affects the entire league in some way, shape, or form. It affects that collegiate draft that just happened back in May, and it affects every little detail throughout the league. But you mentioned that you had him going to the Water Dogs in this situation, and I as well had him going to the Water Dogs, because I think it would have kind of been similar to what we saw from him this summer with the Archers. I think that putting him in the same offense with guys like Kieran McCardle, Ryan Drenner, Wes Berg, and then you even look at that midfield with guys like Connor Kelly. I just think that we would have seen probably the same level of production that he got with the Archers as he would have possibly had with a team like the Water Dogs this summer.
yeah. McArdle is. I mean, he's a freak. He's an excellent player. Had a little bit of an issue with turnovers this last season, but at the same time, excuse me, is a threat nonetheless. Meanwhile, Ryan Drenner, who is one of the coolest people to be in the PLL or ever play lacrosse. It's almost unfair. I see Drenner out there and I'm like, well, I guess I've never been cool in my whole life. But Drenner has a knack for the goal. We all know that. We've seen his overtime winners. He's a threat. Even if he's having an off day, he commands attention from the defense. In Westberg, of course, too, is not just a slouch. So Grant Ament would be great in that offense. We know he would have a lot of fun. Although I have to say he might look a little bit off in purple now that I've seen him in that Archer's orange and that blue. I think I would have enjoyed watching him on any team.
Right.
But seeing him on the Archers with Holman and Manny, and even though Holman struggled a little bit in this last tournament, those guys are such sharpshooters. And to see a guy at X that could just ping those guys and allow them to do those things, that was a real treat. I know I've gotten a little bit off, but I just had to say that.
No, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that having a guy like, whether it's Pat Spencer or a guy like Grant Ament, which we saw his effect on the Archers offense this summer, I think having a guy like that kind of takes the pressure off of guys like Holman and Manny, and I think you saw it with Holman this year, kind of not up to where he was back in 2019 production wise, maybe in the stat columns, but definitely you saw his impact there. But I think that, like I said, when you have a guy at X like that, which they definitely missed out on last summer, it definitely makes a lot of difference for everybody else within that offense.
Totally. And, that was definitely a tough break for the Archers. I think everyone kind of assumed he was going to go play basketball, but at the same time, you can't pass on him and take someone else, and then he decides he wants to play lacrosse and was a total obvious number one pick.
Yeah.
So as the Archers, you were really kind of stuck there. we kind of have to pick him, even though we think he might not even be here.
Yeah.
So that they really were caught there. And as far as Pat Spencer goes, as a lacrosse fan, there's no question that we are all dying to see him go to the PLL. But, good for him. Good on him to make that decision that he felt was best for him. It's my understanding now he's going overseas to play some basketball. And
Yeah.
a part of me wants to wish him well, and a part of me wants to say, hope it doesn't go great. We'll see you in lacrosse next season. But, whatever it is, he's a freak athlete. He's going to be better than you or I at any sport he wants to play. So I hope he does well. I mean, seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that someday we will see him in the PLL, whatever team he ends up being on, possibly as a part of that entry draft that they have there at the PLL. But I think really, whichever way you go, you're not going wrong with either Pat Spencer or Grant Amon. Like, we'd be lucky to have either of those guys in the PLL, let alone both of them possibly sometime here in the future. But that'll pretty much do it for this episode. We covered a lot as far as this whole what if scenario with Pat Spencer versus Grant Amon and everything that kind of goes down the line with that. But it's been a lot of fun covering these last two topics with you here on the podcast. But that'll do it for episode 38. Make sure to check out Taking the Field with Stevie Mac on YouTube, SoundCloud, and Podchaser. And Phil, once again, thanks for joining me. We'll have to get you back on soon.
Thanks so much, brother. I love being here, and I'll look forward to next time.
Yep. All right. See you guys later.